All right. All right, I'm going to kick it off, Tom, if that works.
Yes, it's fine.
Good evening, folks. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Jeff Hulstrung, president of the Green Mountain Audubon Society, a chapter of the National Audubon Society covering Franklin, Grand Isle, and Chittenden counties in Vermont. If you receive the Audubon magazine and you live in one of these counties, you're probably a member of Green Mountain Audubon, so thank you. If you're interested in joining, I'll paste a link to our website in the chat that'll enable you to get more information and join the chapter if you think it's a good idea. Tonight, the Green Mountain Audubon Society is pleased to bring you Larry Clarfeld to discuss the CBC, which is Audubon's Winter Bird Census. We offer this program freely to our members and to the general public in the spirit of generosity. If you'd like to support our programs and our mission to protect birds, you can make a donation in the page that's linked, will be linked in the chat. Our chapter is based in northwestern Vermont, a region which has been sacred to indigenous people for thousands of years. The Western Abnaki are the traditional caretakers of these lands and waters. We respect their connection to this region and remember the hardships they continue to endure. We give thanks for the opportunity to share this place and to work to help protect it. And with that, I will hand it over to my fellow board member, Tom Gimicello, who's our Master of Ceremonies for this evening.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So I'd like to give you folks a little information about our speaker tonight, Lawrence, aka Larry Clarfeld. He's a postdoctoral associate with the Vermont Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. He has a diverse background, having received his bachelor's in mathematics at UVM and master's in conservation biology at Antioch. And he also spent nearly a decade as a teacher-naturalist at North Branch Nature Center, connecting people with the natural world. He completed his PhD in computer science at UVM in 2020 as a graduate fellow in the NSF iGERT Smart Grid program. Who the hell knows what that means, but it says with a certificate in complex systems. Indeed. He developed methods for quantifying the risk to the power grid from cascading blackouts and created a model for understanding information flow in human conversation. As a postdoc, Larry will bring his AI and machine learning quantitative skills to monitoring wildlife by helping computers identify sounds and images of wildlife collected by cell phones, recorders, or camera traps with the R package AMN monitor. Well, Larry, that is quite the workup. So away you go. We are so pleased that you are kicking off our 2022-2023 winter series of programs. With no further ado, it is over to you, Larry.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone at Green Mountain Audubon Society for hosting me here tonight. Yeah, that's quite the introduction. I will say, though, just briefly at the beginning that this presentation is distinct from my work with the Vermont Co-op unit. I put this on as a volunteer, so this is just me having fun here with you all tonight. And with that said, I'm going to attempt to screen share so we can get this show started. And thank you.
Larry's screen sharing, I'm going to pop in and say, if anybody has a question during Larry's presentation, simply type that question into the chat. I will see it, and at the end of the program, I will moderate the questions, and we'll have a question answer period when Larry has finished.
All right, thank you, Tom. Yeah, put questions in as you go. I'm going to try a little bit of call and response. It works. I've had mixed results with this in the online format, but we'll give it a go. So can everybody see my screen shared, though, my really boring cover slide?
Yes, we see it.
Okay. Can you also see the little pane with everybody's pictures on it, or no? Only I can see that.
No, we've hit everybody.
Oh, okay. So maybe only I can see that. All right, let's just get everything configured and properly. Okay, all right, so good. We're good to go. This talk is called The History of the Burlington Christmas Bird Count, and thank you to our hosts, but also thank you for everyone for coming to this talk. I know we advertised it on fairly short notice, but it was a lot of fun to put this together. It's a little bit different than the traditional kind of nature talk that I'll give, because we talk a little bit less about the nature and a little bit more about the people, which are integral to the Christmas bird count. And the Burlington Christmas Bird Count and the Christmas Bird Count in general has a really, really rich history. that for somebody with ADHD who goes to research a topic, it's amazing how you can spend an hour on one slide and then realize that you still have 40 to go. And it's the night before the talk. So it's been a lot of fun to put together. Maybe perhaps this is just part one of this history. And we'll go through, just to give you an overview of the talk, we'll start by just looking at what is the Christmas bird count today, and then we'll rewind to really preceding the Christmas bird count, what the different elements were going on in the world that led to the rise of this really incredible event. We'll talk a little bit about the history of the event in Vermont, specifically focusing in on Burlington, and learn a little bit about some of the very first bird counters in Vermont. And then we'll go at a slightly accelerated pace through the present day, ending with a little bit about what the data has taught us and maybe what we'll be looking at going forward into the future. So with that, the CBC today, well, 3 years ago today, right before COVID, the CBC was really at its peak with numbers, representing over 2,500 count circles, over 81,000 participants logging an 1/8 of a million hours of time counting birds for this event, traversing over 500,000 miles and counting over 2,500 species, roughly a quarter of the world's bird species counted just during this event, for a total of 42 million birds. So without saying, needless to say, this event has been wildly successful. Since its inception, Christmas bird count data has been used for numerous purposes, including conservation planning, such as for the American black duck back in the 80s. It's been cited in hundreds of papers, and this says now, but I actually made this slide about 10 years ago. But this, this event, the data that it's produced has been one of the 24 leading indicators of climate impacts by the EPA in a really landmark study around the time where this concept of climate change was a little bit more contentious than it is today. So with that said, the event wasn't always this big. It's had really incredible growth over the years. If I can figure out how to go, there we go, next slide. It's had incredible growth over the years from its start with 27 participants in the year 1900 to today, around 80,000. So this graph stops in 2010, but the curve continues to grow at this same rapid pace year after year. And so, what got us to this point? Why is this event so successful, and why did it get started in the first place? And to answer that question, we're going to rewind to about 150 years ago. And we're going to look at 3 different case studies that really exemplify why the Christmas bird count got started. So our first case study, anyone recognize this bird? This is where I wish we were all in the same room, because people would be yelling out passenger pigeon. The passenger pigeon is, it's a pretty incredible species. It's amazing how many days go by without even thinking about this species. That was once one of the most abundant species on our continent, and in terms of the bird life. So abundant were they that they would fly over during migration in huge flocks that were said to darken the skies, sometimes taking hours to pass by. And these birds were noisy too. Apparently, not only was it a pretty visually startling display to see these endless flocks migrate over, but they also caused a bit of a ruckus. And so, with so many birds, people, clearly saw an opportunity here, and these birds were pretty easy to hunt, I guess. People would kill them by the thousands. And, for a long time, it was thought that, that's fine. There's so many. This is essentially a limitless bounty from which we can continue to draw year after year without consequence. Well, not everybody thought that was the case. So, somewhere in the mid-1800s, someone proposed a law in Ohio that would restrict the harvest of passenger pigeons. And a select committee that was put together that was opposing this legislation was quoted as saying, "The passenger pigeon needs no protection. Wonderfully prolific, having the vast forests of the north as its breeding grounds, traveling hundreds of miles in search of food. It is here today and elsewhere tomorrow, and no ordinary destruction can lessen them or be missed from the myriads that are yearly produced." So, this is a theme that has come across again and again through history that we think that, what can we as people do to really disrupt this giant earth? We really can't have that substantial of an impact, but clearly, in the case of the passenger pigeon, we did. The stories of people hunting these in extraordinary numbers are just, really pretty mind-boggling. And in some cases, people might actually be, protecting that, protecting their field, their agricultural fields and trying to protect their crops. In other cases, they were shooting these things for fun. And in other cases, it was really, a pretty lucrative industry. Apparently these, they would shoot tons of passenger pigeons and then just use the feathers to stuff mattresses. And, it's very common to have passenger pigeon feathered mattresses, but very quickly, amazingly quickly, the human population reduced the 3 billion passenger pigeons, that's billion with a B, the 3 billion passenger pigeons within the matter of a couple decades were reduced to a couple dozen. And the very last of those passenger pigeons to exist died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914, I believe. Her name was Martha, the very last of her kind. So, lesson learned, right? Well, maybe not. Unfortunately, history has a bad habit of repeating itself. And so the passenger pigeon wasn't the only species around the turn of the 20th century to be in big trouble. Our next case study, we're going to look at the plume trade a little bit. Back 150 years ago, it was considered high fashion to decorate yourself in the lovely plumes of some of our magnificent wading birds like herons and egrets, ibis and storks. And this trade was a really big industry in Florida, including in the Florida Everglades, where wading birds were harvested in, again, truly monstrous numbers, really. This is a report from the late 1800s that 5 million birds were estimated to have been killed for their feathers in that year. And around this time, other people, not everybody was totally in favor of continuing this plume trade. People did begin to see numbers decline. And so there was an effort in the late 1800s, early 1900s to put a stop to this. But when there's money to be made, there's a lot of interests that you're fighting against if you're trying to enact any sort of conservation. And so, some of the very early attempts in the early 1900s were not so successful. This fellow is named Guy Bradley. He's a former plume hunter turned game warden. And he was considered the first bird warden of the Everglades, but unfortunately, fulfilling his duty to protect the bird life of the Everglades ended up taking his life. He was murdered at the age of 35 by poachers. They put, and he wasn't the only victim of the plume trade. Another game warden went missing around the same time, presumed to have been killed. And one of the early Audubon Society leaders was also shot and killed over this, over this issue of trying to protect these birds in southern Florida. I thought this was quite fitting that there was a monument erected in Guy Bradley's memory that was ultimately washed into the sea. But let us not forget the sacrifices of those who come before us, trying to protect wildlife, which is really what it's all about. But the plume trade did come to its end, beginning in the very early 20th century. In 1910, New York State legislature enacted a law that specifically the Audubon plumage law, prohibiting sale or possession of feathers from protected birds. And then a couple years later, in 1913, the most significant legislation really ever to be passed in the U.S. For the protection of birds was passed, the Migratory Bird Act, which protected all birds from hunting, and is still a really crucial piece of legislation to this day. But the same affliction of really extreme harms to our environment exists in so many different facets. And so our third example, and the motivating example for the bird count, was known as the holiday side hunt. So a side hunt was a tradition typically around a holiday, often on Thanksgiving Day or Christmas Day, where a group of men, typically men, at least that's what they are described as in the literature, would split up into two teams and head into the woods together, basically with the goal of shooting anything that they possibly could. Any animal that they could possibly shoot, they would shoot. And oftentimes those different animals were ascribed a different number of points, like an owl might be worth 5 points, a fox might be worth 2. And at the end of the day, they would get back together, compare their harvest, and the team with the most points or the most animals would win. And in some cases, I read about these hunts happening on Thanksgiving, and the losing team had to cook Thanksgiving dinner for the winning team. So these holiday side hunts, really were the epitome of needless slaughter. Like, as terrible as it is in the plume trade, at least they're wearing the feather or something. In this case, they're just killing these things and leaving the carcasses to rot. Like, there's no reason that people should be doing this. And so right around the same time that the plume trade was coming to an end and receiving increased scrutiny, the passenger pigeon had recently disappeared. Was about to disappear. These side hunts were also beginning to be condemned. But here's an example. In 1896, in our very own Enosburg Falls, Vermont, two teams together in one day, killing 565 creatures for sport. Incidentally, in the same publication the very next year, they reported far fewer animals. They said, strange to say, I don't know how strange it is to say, but as they said, strange to say, the side hunt of November 18th, 1897 did not yield such an abundant harvest of dead animals. It is true that only 30 killers were engaged against the 40 of the previous year, but the total of victims on both sides was painfully low. Well, maybe if you shoot all the animals from the woods one year, they're not going to be there the next. It's not rocket science, but traditions die hard, and people really cling to their traditions. And as was the case for passenger pigeons and the plume trade, getting people to change their habits is tough. But in the year 1900, this is right around the birth of the modern conservation movement. A fellow by the name of Frank Chapman, who edited a magazine called Bird Lore, made a proposal. And I'll just read some of this, or maybe I'll read the whole thing. We'll see. It is not many years ago that sportsmen were accustomed to meet on Christmas Day, choose sides, and then as representatives of the two bands resulting, hie them to the fields and woods on the cheerful mission of killing practically everything in fur or feathers that crossed their path, if they could. These exceptional opportunities for winning the laurels of the chase were termed side hunts, and reports of the hundreds of non-game birds that were sometimes slaughtered during a single hunt were often published in our leading sportsmen's journals, with perhaps a word of editorial commendation for the winning side. We are not certain that the side hunt is wholly a thing of the past, but we feel assured that no reputable sportsman's journal of today would venture to publish an account of one unless it were to condemn it. And this very radical change of tone is one of the significant signs of the times. Now, Bird Lore proposes a new kind of Christmas side hunt in the form of a Christmas bird census, and we hope that all of our readers who have the opportunity will aid us in making it a success by spending a portion of Christmas Day with the birds and sending a report of their hunt to Bird Lore before they retire that night. Such report should be headed by the locality. So this part is important. So at this point, Chapman has introduced the concept. Really, I doubt that many side hunters are going to be putting their guns down and whipping out their binoculars, but he's appealing to people who are already interested in birds to really take it upon themselves as really just a symbolic gesture to go count birds. Like, I don't know how much this is displacing the side hunt as much as it is offering an alternative for birders who want to get in on the camaraderie and the competition. And so reading on, Chapman says that you're supposed to include in your list the locality, the hour of starting and returning, character of the weather, direction and force of the wind, and the temperature, with the latter taken when starting. So even from its inception, Chapman is setting the scene so that we not only have the number of birds that people are recording, but also the conditions in which they've recorded those birds, which is really important when it comes to comparing counts from year to year. And this was part of the bird count at its inception. Promptness in sending these lists to Bird Lore is urged in order that the best of them may be published in our February number. So now Chapman is further enticing participants by giving them the opportunity to have their counts published in this nationally distributed magazine. So this is a pretty cool thing to do. I think Chapman really sets it up quite well early on for success. And that is how it all began. And we'll take a look at that February issue in just a minute and the very first CBC results. But first, a couple a couple more words about Frank Chapman. Chapman was born in 1864 in Englewood, New Jersey, and although he didn't have any formal naturalist training, he got a job pretty early, pretty young at the American Museum of Natural History, starting as a volunteer, and then eventually getting a staff position. And from the late 1800s, rising through the ranks to become first curator of mammals and then curator of birds for the Museum of Natural History. He's considered to be a really influential figure in the museum's history, having traditionally prior to Chapman, the dioramas that you typically have in a museum were basically study skins. They were prepared specimens laid out in rows on a table, whereas Chapman really pushed for having their exhibits featuring birds in habitat and in lifelike positions. And so his influence on really just how these different museum specimens are curated and displayed to the public is part of his lasting legacy. He was also a prominent author, publishing multiple field guides. It's really neat to flip through his field guide, and a lot of these older field guides have entered the public domain and have been digitized and are available to browse online. So he had a really quite well distributed field guide at the time. For a while, he was the associate editor for Auk, which is one of the leading ornithological publications of its time, and of course the founder of Bird Lore magazine, the precursor to Audubon. But perhaps Chapman's greatest legacy is that of having been the creator of the Christmas Bird Count that still exists today. So that very first, January-February issue, 1901, there's 27 people who counted birds, and all of those results were published in Bird Lore magazine. The closest we got to Vermont that very first year, I believe, was Keene, New Hampshire. But that very first year, the very first couple years, we did not have any Vermont counts. The first Vermont CBC took place in 1903. And at the beginning of Chapman's summary, typically the results were displayed as first an editorial summary or editorial commentary, followed by each of the results enumerated. And he said in this summary, all of the reports are interesting, from the ones which contain no birds to that listing nearly 40 species, and some of them have records of more than usual value. So from the early days, he's imprinting that it's important whether you see birds or not. And that hopefully made Gilbert H. Trafton feel a little bit better about his day out in the field. He added his commentary to his measly 4 birds that he saw in almost a full day of hiking. He said that the number of birds seen was very small, but it gives a fair indication of the winter bird life here. I passed many days without seeing or hearing a single bird. Now, if I was to see only 3 species of birds in a day, I wouldn't mind one of them being a shrike. So good on you, Gilbert, for getting the shrike on Vermont's very first CBC. But this is this is what it's all about in taking a census. We don't care if we see a few birds or a ton of birds. It's all about just getting out there and seeing what's there. And so, with this very first Vermont Christmas Bird Count in Randolph Center in the year 1903, I decided to do a little bit of digging and try to see if I could learn a little bit more about Gilbert H. Trafton. And it turns out that our very first Christmas bird counter was a fairly influential figure. Gilbert Haven Trafton, born January 9th, 1874, in South Eliot, Maine, was a teacher as his career. He taught in the normal school in Randolph, Vermont for a couple years in the very early 1900s, as well as a number of other schools in the Northeast, before eventually settling in the early 1911 as on the faculty of the biology department at Mankato State University in Minnesota. He remained on the faculty there until his death in 1943, and was so influential, leading the biology department for 32 years that ultimately in the 70s, they named their science center after him. So there's now a Trafton Science Center dedicated in his honor. A little anecdote out of one of these publications. These pictures and quotes have come out of the University of Minnesota, or Minnesota State University's archives. And I liked this commentary. Mr. Trafton, who since he joined the college faculty in 1911 has taught more than 10,000 students here, is a very definite part of the tradition of the college. Some of the things his students remember him for are his kindness, his consideration, his sense of humor, and his illegible handwriting. Freshmen were advised, the story goes, that Professor Trafton will only tell you twice. The first time he will tell you, and the next time he will write it on the board. He had better get it the first time. And so, on top of being like a birder and our first CBCer, he was also an accomplished author, having put out over 13 different manuals and textbooks, some of which gained international recognition, and quite a few of which were actually about birds and bird life. This was another quote out of those Minnesota State University archives, that Trafton is remembered as a great lover of birds. He converted his cottage into a haven for the early feathered emigrants to Mankato. A yearbook of the 30s reported that if a bird could find its way to Mr. Trafton's home, it would find an invitation to take a bath and a free lunch. The only bird who was known to get the cold shoulder was, and of course, let me move that away, was the pesky English sparrow. I don't think you can see this, but I have a little bar that I have to move around to free up space occasionally. So anyway, Gilbert H. Trafton, a really fairly important historical figure who was our very first Christmas bird counter. And that was in 1903. He didn't do another Vermont CBC. The next year he did a Christmas bird count in where was it? He did it in Passaic, New Jersey, where he was at that time. And then I'm not sure if he did any more Christmas bird counts after that. But the very first Burlington Christmas bird count took place in 1905 and was conducted by Emma E. Drew, who counted just a couple birds, a Cooper's hawk, some crows, downy woodpecker, white-breasted and red-breasted nuthatch, and some chickadees, for a total of 6 species and 30 individuals. Now, Emma, I also tried to learn a little bit about, and it turns out that Emma M. Drew was quite involved in the birding community. She was treasurer for a time of the Audubon Society of Vermont, and occasionally published articles in bird lore. This is an excerpt from an article that Emma posted, or that Emma published, about some cedar waxwings that she raised. While my uncle and I were in the Adirondacks last summer, we had the pleasure of bringing up by hand a cedar waxwing. It was after a strong windstorm about August 1st that the little bird was brought us by a man who had found it on the ground, evidently blown away from his home and friends. And the story goes on to talk about how this was a loving pet and almost like a member of their family by the time the bird was ready to be re-released into the wild. There wasn't quite as much information about Emma M. Drew as there was Vermont's very first Christmas bird counter, but I did find this interesting quote, which maybe sheds a little bit of light onto, at least in the later part of her life, how Emma Drew appreciated bird life. In a letter to the editor of Bird Lore, this was also published in Bird Lore, I send a few notes on birds, not because I feel these notes to be of value, but because some of your readers must, like myself, live an out-of-door life for several years to regain, in a measure, health and strength, and who, because of inability to walk or drive very much, feel that even the study of birds is not for them. For nearly 7 years, I have been forced to live in the woods in the Adirondacks. For 4 years, I've spent most of the spring and fall months in the little country village of Jay, almost in the heart of the ancient woods. Most of my days have been spent in a steamer chair on the wide piazza doing nothing. I have not been from the porch at any time except during the last year, when I have been able to take some long drives through the wonderful woodsy places. And yet I have a list of 140 birds seen in this way, and have made friends with quite a number. My idea is to show some discouraged invalid that there is real pleasure and work in watching birds, even from a steamer chair on a piazza. So, it's a little bit sad to think of Emma Drew, after doing her Burlington Christmas bird counts, being confined to this porch in the Adirondacks, but it gives you a glimpse into the power and the value of birds and bird watching that they can have on a person, no matter what that person's condition. And so Emma Drew continued doing Christmas bird counts for a number of years in Burlington. This is a little snippet from the 6th Christmas bird count. And I just wanted to read a paragraph from Frank Chapman's introduction to this year's results. He says, in these annual censuses, therefore, we are gradually accumulating a mass of exact information, interesting in itself, and in aggregate affording a definite basis for comparison with results obtained in succeeding years, and having consequently a real scientific value. So, it was from the very beginning, it was really in these very first years that Chapman saw the potential for this as a long-term count to inform us about bird populations and how they change over time. And so, that has been realized in full, probably far beyond Chapman's wildest dreams. But from the very beginning, that was part of the plan. So a bird count did take place in Burlington on that very 7th year of the Christmas bird count. On the 8th year, no Burlington count took place. However, I just pulled this out because, again, Chapman is emphasizing how it doesn't matter if you see a few birds or a lot of birds. It's about getting out there and counting the birds as they are. It's that is the idea of the census, and that is something that Chapman really tried to make sure it was driven home. I think there's sometimes an impression, especially in today's society, to think that nature is somewhere else. Like we look at the Discovery Channel and we see far off jungles and tropical paradise, and who would think that in Vermont in the winter there could be so many birds? Contrary to the very first bird counters, sentiments that there's hardly any birds in Vermont in the winter at all. Certainly over the years we found that not to be the case, and while we don't end up with the spectacular species totals of some of our southern counterparts, we do it and we love it nonetheless here in Vermont, no matter what the weather.
Larry, I'm going to break in with a question from your friend Chip Darmstadt. On the last 1907 census that you showed, it had one of the birds being a snowflake. And so Chip wants to know, what's a snowflake?
We're going to come back to that.
Oh, sorry, Chip.
So I saw that too. And at first I was wondering why they were discussing the weather in the species tally. We'll come back to that. We'll leave you hanging. But good to know that people are still out there. It's always a little weird doing these online and not seeing anybody. Okay, so we just did 1908. Let's move on to 1909, where no Burlington count took place, but there was, however, a count in Essex Junction, Vermont, which is within the Burlington Circle. So it makes it into our list of things to discuss. This was another small count. It had an English pheasant, a wild pheasant, which I guess were more prevalent back then in the area, and 27 more snowflakes, which we'll discuss again a little bit later. And this was a count performed by Carlton D. Howe. So this is the last person we're really going to take a deep dive into, but I wanted to see who was Carlton D. Howe. It turns out that in addition to leading the Essex Junction CBC for 3 years, Howe was an officer at the Audubon Society of Vermont. He was actually the president in 1902, and he was the founder of the Vermont Bird Club. In 1901, he was the guy who was tasked with coming up with a proposal to start this bird club and propose some bylaws. And ultimately, the bird club formed in 1902. And the Vermont Bird Club still exists in one form today, which we'll discuss in another couple minutes. He's also the author of a really cool book called 50 Common Birds of Vermont. This book is actually now freely available online. So it's interesting to look back over 100 years ago, 120 years ago, and see, what were the 50 common birds in Vermont back then? Not all of them are so common today. And he was a prominent educator. In 1908, he'd given 44 different talks and lectures about birds, almost all to school children and teachers. And it was for that purpose that he was commissioned to publish this book, 50 Common Birds of Vermont. It was prepared for teachers and school officers to help engage students in bird life and provide them with a field guide specific to our Vermont birds. This is a picture out of that book. Guess the species. It's a common nighthawk. Not so common these days, but the commentary in that field guide was that it's quite common in some localities and sparingly common in others. Interesting tidbit that in the dedication or in the acknowledgements of this book, Frank Chapman is acknowledged for providing excerpts from Chapman's field guide that were reused in 50 Common Birds of Vermont, and Howe actually went down to the American Museum of Natural History and photographed some of the specimens that were in Chapman's purview. And so Chapman gets acknowledged for that as well. So another interesting connection back to the Christmas Bird Count founder and one of its first Vermont participants. And Howe continued to do the count for several years, but then after 1911, there wasn't another Christmas bird count in Burlington for quite some time. But that is not to say that birding stopped altogether in our area. In fact, 1912, Emma Drew did one more Burlington count, the last Burlington bird count to take place for several decades, in concert with Nellie M. Day, who was also involved as an officer with the Audubon Society of Vermont and the Vermont Bird Club. And while the Christmas bird counting stopped for some time, birding continued. And the Vermont Bird Club, which had been founded in 1902, as we mentioned previously, in the year 1914, joined courses with the earlier, the Vermont Botanical Club, which had formed some years earlier. And these merged into an organization that still exists today as the Vermont Bird and Botanical Club, and still has members and leads a yearly retreat, its main event. The club was also affiliated with National Audubon from the very beginning, and experienced a lot of rapid growth in those early days, ballooning from 94 members to 250 at that time in 1915. So birding in Vermont went on, but quite some time passed before another Burlington Christmas bird count would take place. A couple other just significant milestones in general CBC history along the way. In 1940 was where, due to the increasing popularity of the bird count, the bird lore first proposed that they might actually start charging people for this to help cover the printing costs, which were becoming really unaffordable for that organization. And then in 1941, another significant event, the name changed. It changed from the Christmas bird census to the Christmas bird count, as somewhat of an acknowledgement that perhaps our methods need to be really scrutinized carefully, and that perhaps this is not a true census, as the word implies, given that it's an area for all forms present therein cannot be fully covered. Such complete coverage cannot be possible and obtained during the course of one day, and therefore bound to be more or less superficial. So little known facts that in 1941 it changed from the Christmas bird census to the Christmas bird count the following year. Fast forward a couple more years, 1949, the first year since 1912 that the Burlington Christmas bird count occurred. This was around the time of the end of World War II, and it's interesting to look at how historical events such as the war impacted this long-running bird count. So they published this in that 1949 edition of I think at this time it might have been Audubon magazine, or what came slightly after Audubon magazine, that was publishing these results. But they remarked on the fact that there was a huge dip in participation right around the time of the war. And there was actually certain restrictions. Like, I didn't know this until I started reading this history, but there was restrictions about using binoculars along the coast, because that could be considered potentially a hostile threat. So certain bird counts did take place, but without the use of optics. So certain counts of birds along the shore went down during this time, and species tallies went down during this time. But this is one of the nice things about having such an incredible longitudinal study, such as the CBC, where you have not 5 years or 10 years, but decades and decades of data. So even if you have a 5-year blip in your numbers, long-term trends are still apparent. And so this is the beginning of the modern Christmas bird count. It took in Burlington. It took a couple years for Burlington to settle on its count circle, which persists today. And I like that in this very first year of the latest iteration, that 5% of the count actually took place in pig pens or garbage. I thought that was kind of funny. But the count moves around ever so slightly until 1955, when it meets its final resting point, centered where the College Street meets the lake and extending 7.5 miles out in any direction. And that 1955 count circle is still used to this day. Fast forward a little bit to 1962. This is when Green Mountain Audubon Society formed. It was formed with the mission of promoting environmental education, wildlife protection, and land conservation. And it was also around this time that GMAS acquired the Nature Center in Huntington. And we won't dive too deep into GMAS history, but to say that very early on after its founding, the Audubon Society became a very active part in the organization of the Burlington CBC, and remains so to this day. Another, just a little snippet that I had to pull out because I thought it was of interest. From 1969, this was again in the editor's notes, but that compiler after compiler complained that habitats in all sectors of the circle being rapidly consumed by commercial and residential building. Surrounding swamps and marshes were being steadily and rapidly drained, and even unused lands were being bulldozed to eliminate unsightly trees and bushes. One city official, when questioned, said, "Trees and bushes breed immorality." In one section of the Cocoa, Florida circle, where 12 years ago one could stand and see 3 pairs of bald eagles on nests simultaneously, there's now nothing but hundreds of acres of compact, overcrowded, unattractive housing developments. And so the country, quote unquote, progresses. So it's really fun to read back through these old CBCs and see the types of commentary that took place, which really could be thought of as somewhat of an activist commentary. And we have to remember back to the early days, the founding of Audubon. This wasn't just an organization to foster education and appreciation of birds, but it was really active in conservation advocacy. And in each of these issues that contains results from the Christmas bird count, there was a section at the end of an update from officers that Audubon would have different officers trying to basically lobby different legislatures to impose local laws protecting birds. And that, this is part of what this is all about. Is it's fun to count the birds. It's fun to get into the competitive spirit and see what we find, and enjoy the company of our friends. But that it rings true that Audubon and hopefully many of us who also appreciate birds are noticing when they're not doing well and speaking up and doing something about it. To further emphasize that, here's a little clip from the 1972 commentary. So we are all well aware that segments of the pesticide industry and certain paid quote unquote scientist spokesmen are citing Christmas bird count totals and other data in American birds as proving that the bird life of North America is thriving, and that many species are actually increasing despite the widespread and condemned use of DDT and other non-degradable hydrocarbon pesticides. And so it turned out that some of these lobbyists in support of the chemical industry were basically distorting CBC data and equating an increase in participation, resulting in an increase in birds, with the fact that birds are doing well. And so it's always important to keep into consideration that as we're counting birds and as we're amassing this long-term data set of how it can be interpreted and how it can be misinterpreted and how it should be interpreted. And so that is just something that a little anecdote I want to pull out to highlight that point. I heard a little noise in the background. Are we doing well? Are there any questions at this point? Everyone's still there?
We have no questions currently.
All right. Well, then we forge ahead. I did leave plenty of time for questions, hopefully at the end of this talk. So if you are holding some, I'm planning that we'll have time to discuss. And so the count went on. The count starting in 1951 had a listed compiler. Elizabeth Ball was the very first compiler of this new iteration of the Christmas bird count. And the compiler is generally just in charge of totaling up the numbers and helping to coordinate and submitting those to Audubon. That after that very first year, Marion L. Smith took over for more than a decade, after which Barbara Eastman, who had been a long-time participant prior to taking over as compiler, took on that role from 1974 to 1992. From 92 to 94, Craig Provost, still active in the Vermont birding community, took over as compiling during that period. From 95 to 96, it was David Bailey, and then from 97 to 2001, Mark Labar of Audubon, Vermont, took over as compiler. And then, there's a bit of a gap in the data. Hopefully we can fill in some of these gaps for exact years. But I believe Mark continued to be involved during a transition, at which point the Green Mountain Audubon Society took a much more active role in organizing the count. And somewhere around that time in the early 2000s is when Shirley Johnson helped to take over as not the compiler, but really the coordinator of the count, helping with also the compilation, but in particular, the coordinating of volunteers, assigning people to territories, making sure the circle was well covered, and then for many, many years, hosting the after count potluck at her home, and hosting tons of people to an incredible chili dinner where we told stories, reminisced about our days, and tallied up the birds that we had seen. It was also around the same time that Eric Lazarus took over as count compiler, and up until last year, really did an incredible job getting this count organized and and keeping the data clean and tidy, and really laying a really great foundation and for his successor. I'm taking over as count compiler this year, and Eric has left some pretty big shoes to fill, and left the count in really good shape. So it's been really a group effort over the course of multiple generations to sustain this count. And really, these counts are fun. Like there's a little bit of a competitive nature to it, which it's a friendly competitive nature. It's really person versus themselves to see how much you can find given your constraints of having to survey a predefined territory. And the count has engaged countless people over the years.
Larry, I'm going to jump in and tell you that the Queen of Chili and Hospitality, Miss Shirley Johnson, is attending this presentation. And I'm thinking that at the end of it, I will let people start their video so that we can acquiesce to your wish, and we'll be able to see everybody for the question and answer period.
Okay, and I'm realizing that I'm going a little bit slower than I thought, so I'm going to put my foot on the gas a teeny bit so we can leave time for questions. But I want to acknowledge the 587 people who have participated in this count less than 10 times, with the average being actually between 2 and 3 times each. So, people who do this count tend to come back, and there's a lot of them. This list, I needed to hand compile this list from the paper records, and so there may be errors still, but an impressive amount of people participating at least a couple times. 46 people participating between 10 and 20 years. 9 people participating between 20 and 30 years. And 3 participants at least with more than 30 years of Burlington Christmas bird counts under their belt. And I believe Dick Park is in the lead with 32 at this point, although I do have a couple years of missing data. So, I mean, the longevity of participation in this event is really impressive and speaks to the quality of the event and the amount of fun that people have with this event. You don't do something for 30 years if you don't enjoy it. So now a quick note about changing names with changing times. We might go a little bit long here, but we'll make it work. Changing names with changing times. It's another fun thing about looking at old records are the old names that birds used to have. In some cases, they were, just sort of informal language like marshhawk. Snowflakes, which Chip mentioned early in the talk, I believe those are snow buntings. But names change for a number of reasons. We just become more formal and more consistent. Common snipe, we lost to Europe and it became Wilson snipe. Old squaw was retired for reasons of just that it was really insensitive to a particular group of people. Was replaced with long-tailed duck. So names of birds change over time. The publication changed over time. What started as bird lore, ultimately, those were published in American Birds, and nowadays they're not published in print. They're just published online. And even the event itself has changed names from the census to the count. So it's interesting to think going forwards what will happen and how we'll be referring to things. There's a big movement afoot to start naming birds rather than after people, some of which have a past that's riddled with objectionable behaviors, to name the birds after some characteristic of the bird itself. Even the name of Audubon has been suggested as needing reform, and certainly the term Christmas bird count is not particularly inviting to people who aren't of that religious persuasion. So it'll be interesting to see how this event continues to evolve as time goes on, which I'm sure it will, in terms of both the practices and the ways that we refer to things. All right, so we'll go at rapid speed through the last couple slides. Rarities and highlights. There's been a ton of really cool birds seen over the years. It's interesting to see how certain boreal species that were rare even back then have just become non-existent. But to think that there was actually 4 years with boreal chickadees, some years multiple individuals between the late 60s and the early 80s is pretty startling. Other birds appear in this list that I'm not sure that they were ever approved by the Vermont Birds Records Committee, but there's been some real gems on this count over the years, and that's one of the fun aspects of it, is you just never know what you're going to find until you get out there. And now to look at some trends. We have erupted species of birds. These are species that show up in irregular numbers each year, typically driven by food availability farther north. When food is sparse in the north, they come south in larger numbers. And those are birds like pine grosbeak, Bohemian waxwing, common redpoll. And as the CBC data reveals, that they're not only birds that breed farther north, but even our blue jay is an eruptive species, with its numbers fluctuating drastically from year to year. And then other species are eruptive, but have essentially disappeared from our count altogether, like the evening grosbeak, which was quite common through the 80s into the early 90s, and since has been extremely rare. We're starting to see a little rebound of evening grosbeaks, or at least we had a big push in the fall. It'll be interesting to see if one shows up during the Christmas bird count this year. Ruffed grouse, another bird that has declined, and habitat changes over time. A lot of our early successional forests that ruffed grouse really loved have been disappearing as our area has had its forest regenerate and mature through time. And ruffed grouse is now a really hard one for us to get on the CBC. On the other hand, there's been some great success stories, some great conservation success stories, with the ban of DDT starting in the late 70s and reintroduction programs for some of our most magnificent raptors like bald eagle. We've seen a huge rebound, likewise with peregrine falcon. Another species, wild turkey, that had been extirpated from Vermont, had a really wildly successful reintroduction program starting in the 80s, and today is a common feature of all Vermont Christmas bird counts. All right, here I'm gonna skip the quizzes so that we have time for questions, because we're running low. This is the white-throated sparrow, a species that's been increasing in recent years. And interestingly, I just thought this was kind of neat. I don't know why, but while the white-throated sparrow has increased, the song sparrow has remained fairly steady. So it'll be interesting to see if that trend continues and to try to figure out why. Here's another quiz bird. We won't do a call and answer, but I'll leave just a second for you to ponder what species this could be. If anyone was thinking eastern bluebird, you're correct. As I said, the CBC is one of the 24 leading indicators of climate change by the EPA in a landmark study I think it was in the 2010s that came out, or the late 2000s. And bluebird is one of many species that have just seen a extremely rapid increase in numbers over the decades in our Christmas bird count. But not all species are doing well. Take a moment to ponder what species this could be, whose numbers peaked in the early 90s and have been steadily declining ever since. I almost guarantee that nobody thought of this species, but believe it or not, mallard. Mallard numbers are actually on the decline. And this trend is evident if you look outside of CBC too. Very recently, eBird started these trend maps that show trends from 2007 to the present, which show widespread declines of mallard duck, which, while still common, the fact that we see it declining now should raise alarm bells. And back to Chapman's point, it's all about counting what's there. It doesn't matter if it's rare, if it's common, or if you see no birds at all. All of that data is a piece of the puzzle to help inform us about the populations of birds. And in a landmark study that came out in 2019, it was found that 3 billion birds have been lost since 1970. That's an incredible number of birds. 3 billion was the number of passenger pigeons that were wiped out in the matter of a couple decades in the mid to late 1800s. And here we are, in the previous 5 decades, we've wiped out that same equivalent of birds across the world. So, birds are not doing well, really. There's a major cause for concern and continued efforts to monitor them so that we can keep track of and be on top of these declines, and to advocate for them. And most importantly, or maybe not most importantly, but in tandem, equally as importantly, teaching the next generation to care for and care about these birds, which the CBC is a great way to do that. So, this is our shout out to get involved. The Burlington CBC is Sunday, December 18th. There's an email address on the screen, or you can visit the Green Mountain Audubon Society website for more information and how to sign up. And of course, our Count Circle is one of many in Vermont and many across the Western Hemisphere. So there's through Audubon's website, you can pull up this interactive map and find a Christmas bird count near you to get involved with. And so I've went a little bit longer than I thought, but I do want to give a few shout outs. Clem, thank you for inviting me to give this talk. Shirley, thank you for leading the group for so long, and for a great conversation leading up to this talk about the history of our local count. Eric, Lazarus, for putting the bird count in such great shape and making the data so easy and accessible for me to help prepare this. Jacob putting this up online and helping with some of the programmatic aspects, and the rest of our Burlington Christmas Bird Count Planning Committee, Elizabeth, Jeff, and Ali. So thank you, and thank you everyone for being here and listening. I imagine this will be just the start of my Burlington Christmas Bird Count research and exploration. So perhaps we'll do a follow-up to this at some point in the future. With the very little time I've left, I think we'll do questions. So thanks everyone.
What I'm going to do, Larry, is I'm going to actually allow people to change their video so we can see them. But also there is a note from Bruce McPherson that I'd like to read to you as people can decide if they'd like to start their video. And he said, just add to your excellent presentation. Bob Spear founded the GMAS in 1962 and organized the participation of the GMAS in the CBC in 63. Bob signed up 24 participants and divided them into 10 teams. They identified 45 species and counted 3,419 birds. Participant names available on request. So our past president of the Green Mountain Audubon Society, Bruce, is available to give some background and some information.
Awesome. Thanks, Bruce. I'm going to follow up with you. That would be, yeah, that's really great. And I did see Bob Spear's name on the participant list for many, many years. I'm going to see if I can switch my screen share to this this mode. I don't know if that worked or not.
No, I'm still seeing your screenshot.
You're still seeing the slideshow?
Yes.
I don't know. How's that? Maybe I'll just stop screen sharing.
There you go. So if anybody has any questions at this point, you can type them into the chat and I will convey them. We have never done this before, letting people have their video be present, but we'll see if we can figure this out. If not, make sure to thank Larry. Larry, I thought your presentation was superb. I didn't know a lot of these facts. I learned a great deal. I'm sure that everybody else learned a great deal. I publicly want to thank you for volunteering to become the next compiler. It's a huge job. It's an important job. It is the transition from the field to fact. And so I really think that it's amazing. I thank you for your time tonight to be able to give this first kickoff presentation. And I hope that everybody is able to participate, if willing and able, on December 18th. We have other events coming up that you can check on the Green Mountain Audubon website event calendar. And also in the chat, you'll notice that our president, Jeff Hulstrong, has put a link to our donation and our membership. Now you're getting just a lot of kudos, young man. Great job, Larry. Very interesting. Here's a question. Is there a push to change the name to Winter Bird Census?
So I mean, I'm pretty new as compiler. I can't say that I know of any push nationally. I know that a number of our local Vermont counts have taken it upon themselves to do some rebranding, and we've actually had the conversation amongst the planning committee at within the Burlington circle that we pretty deliberately refer to it now as mainly the CBC. But at the same time, it's still part of this national event that remains the Audubon Christmas Bird Count. So I did want to sort of allude to the fact that it'll be interesting to see as time goes on how that changes, but certainly while its traditions root back to the Christmas holiday, it's one of the most secular things that you can do this time of year. Like there's very few organized secular events that take place in late December. This is actually one of them. So I think it's about time that the name personally reflects that. So we'll see what happens as time goes forwards. I'd imagine that there will be more of a push for that in the not too distant future.
So I am manually asking people to start their video, so at least you get the chance to see the people that have had the great opportunity to benefit from your knowledge. So we'll see if we can get a few more people here. I see Mr. McPherson there. You're getting all sorts of kudos. Thanks, Larry. Terrific presentation. And at least you'll get a chance to see everybody. We're not going to unmute them, but at least you'll be able to have people looking at you and giving you the high sign.
Well, thank you, everybody. I think that it's been interesting to research a lot of these topics. I think one thing that I underestimated was just how long it would take to go through all of the older historical documents, and some of the more recent history. I did get to talk with Shirley a little bit before this talk, but didn't really even end up having the ability to incorporate much of that into today's talk. So maybe there will be a round two next year with a bit more focus on the recent history, and perhaps we can, over that year, have some conversations about the count and some stories, and it's the event is so much about the people that I think that's an important part to capture. So.
And I would like to ask everybody to raise their right hand and wave goodbye to Larry. And now put your other hand up and let's have a round of applause for our presenter. Thank you very much. Thanks to Clem and the program committee. And I wish you all a very good night. Thanks again, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, Tom. Spoken like a true teacher.
Oh, you know it.